Welcome to our lecture on sewing curved seams and the 411 basic information on closures. So our objectives today is to understand concave and convex seams and to understand closures and particularly buttons and how to attach one. So concave and convex seams, concave, it curves inward, and convex curves outward. Okay, so pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And you've done curved seams, so it's not new, but you want to be able to control curved seams because obviously they're more difficult than straight seams. So curving outwards is a convex seam. As you can see, this is convex and this is concave. Now, how to sew them? And I put need to snip first. You can snip first before sewing the seam or after, but you do need to snip in order for it to be straight, okay, and not pucker and not, bunch up. So in order for it to lay flat, you need to snip into the seam allowance. Now what's really important is that you snip into the seam allowance and not past it. That's why it helps if you're going to snip first to do a stitch from the seam allowance. So if you have 1/2 inch seam allowance, stitch 1/2 inch from the edge or 1/4 of an inch, or if you do commercial patterns, 5/8 of an inch. But basically you want to snip but not into the stitch because then you'll cut it off. So you want to snip right in here and like where you see the scissors, and it'll allow it to move and be a little bit more flexible. Okay, now there's two different ways of snipping and it depends on the curve, believe it or not. So on a convex curve you would cut little V's or notches. So on a convex you actually want to do little V's, okay, little notches, and on a concave you want to cut slits. So this is a concave, so you want to do some slits. And if it was curving outward, like on this part, the outward part, you'd want to do little V's. So you're going to do little notches. So here is a great example of that. So a convex, you have to have the little V. See, it creates these little notches. And if you have a concave, you do the little slits. See that? Okay, so that will help you, depending on what you're cutting, you're snipping, make sure that you snip correctly, and it'll allow the curved seam to be nice and flat. In home sewing, you can add a stitch to stabilize the grain line. It's not always, usually it's not done in production sewing, to be honest. They don't stitch first. They just line up the pieces and they sew. For home sewing, however, in a lot of the tutorials, we'll show you to stitch first as a guide and then go ahead and join the pieces of fabric together. So align your fabric pieces together and pin, since you guys are beginning, but in production you don't pin. You'd sew a lock stitch or a straight needle, single needle stitch and back stitch at the beginning and end. So if you have a sewing machine, you're gonna sew and back stitch. If you don't have a sewing machine, you're going to do a regular back stitch, stitch all the way. So I gave you a tutorial video, and it goes over. She does stitch before you actually join the pieces together. So please take a look at that video. Closures. So for closures, need to know the difference between findings and trims. So for findings, all components of a garment except for the body fabric. So anything that's not the self fabric is considered findings. Now in findings, it's a giant umbrella for things like trims, labels, threads, elastics, closures, etc. Okay, now trims are specifically decorative, so like ribbons, laces, etc., etc. But we're going to focus on closures, which is like zippers, which you've done already on your skirt, buttons, and hook and eye. Again, you've done hook and eye on your skirt. So the only thing really that's missing or that's left would be buttons. So closures, so just so you know, are fasteners that secure garment openings. They unfasten to enlarge a garment for dressing or undressing and fasten a garment to fit the body. So that includes buttons with their buttonholes, zippers, snaps, hook and eyes, hook and loop tape, for example, with Velcro. There's lots of different closures. Now buttons, they can be functional or decorative. So functional, conceal button closures and buttons inside double-breasted garments to help them hang smoothly, for example. They serve a purpose to open or close. They're functional. Decorative, it's a non-functional button, which is just for show, just for, it looks nice, and that's it. So sometimes you can have a double-breasted garment and there's buttons on the inside and they actually close, right? They go through the buttonhole. And there's others that are just decorative. It looks double-breasted, but that it doesn't close on anything. It's just there to look like it's double-breasted. So that would be a decorative button. So you can have a functional button or decorative. A functional button can also be decorative. It can actually function, but it can be a novelty button. It can be shaped like something cute and still button up. So in order for it to be functional, it has to be able to go through a buttonhole. and there needs to be a buttonhole there. It needs to be functional. A lot of the most common material for buttons are plastic, and it can be dyed any color. And if they fade, and some do, they tend to look yellowish. So those that fade to yellow, if you have old buttons, those are lesser quality. Often they're out of molded nylon or stamped polyester. Those are the most common. Natural materials, it can be made out of wood, metal, animal horn, leather, shell or mother of pearl, nuts or seeds, or even glass, and those are more expensive. Metal is made by stamping out brass face and attaching it to a metal base, and it's very durable. It's also very expensive. Metallized, it can be gold or silver colored. It's usually a metal coating. They coat it with a metal, but usually the base is plastic, so it will chip and peel. And self-covered buttons with fabric, they're great when you can't find a button that has the color that you want. You can cover it with some fabric that match, self fabric from your garment, and it'll match it exactly, and it's perfect. So these are just examples: wood, leather, shell, very common, but lots of different materials that you can see what buttons are made of. Lines is the sizing of the button. So 40 lines is a diameter of 1 inch. So 1 inch equals 40 lines. Okay, so when they say it's 20 lines, that would mean half an inch. Okay, if it's 80 lines, it's 2 inches. So the button size should be proportional to the size of the garment. Large buttons are placed farther apart than smaller buttons, and you buy them by the gross. When you buy them in this industry, and a gross is 144 pieces. So you can sample, usually for sampling for wholesale, you get them for free often, or sometimes they charge you for some samples, but basically you buy them by the gross, so 144 is what comes in a gross. And the type eyed, which has eyes, and it's either 2 or 4 holes, and you can see through the holes, or it's a shank button. So I give you a video tutorial on how to sew these. So you have the 4-hole, the 2-hole, and it shows you just how to sew, your hand sew. You can sew them by machine, and you do a setting on your machine. There's a buttonhole setting. Each machine has it, so you have to look at the manual. It basically needs a different a presser foot, has basically a zigzag, and you have to align it to make sure that the needle doesn't hit the plastic or it will break the needle, and it just goes in and back and forth, back and forth. So the tutorial shows you by hand how to hand sew a 2-hole and a 4-hole. And for 4-hole, you can just go parallel stitches like this, or crisscross is very common and we like it. So you can do parallel or crisscross. I tend to like crisscross, but that's up to you. So you have some options there for your 4-hole and your 2-hole and your shank button. Okay, so the video goes over a 2-hole, a 4-hole, and a shank button. So make sure you review that. The lecture continues just basic information on more closures like fasteners. So they come in metal or plastic, and they can be sewn by hand or machine. And they're used on like dressier fabrics, lighter weight. They tend to have 2 parts, a ball stud and a socket. And sometimes you can have snap tape, so it makes it easier to apply. Okay, so it's right there. There's snap tape to make it easier to apply and to offer stability. You can't just put a snap on any lightweight fabric. It would tear, so you need either reinforcement. Usually snap tape is the most common, or you have to use interfacing. But you can't just do it. I remember when I first started, I was so young, and I wanted to do eyelets and snaps, and I just did it right on rib fabric, and of course it ripped because it can't handle it. It can't handle that weight, so it needs reinforcement. Now in the industry, we use mechanically attached are better. They hold better. You can do it by hand like this and pound it in. You can also use snap setters with your hand. They look like pliers, but all I can tell you is they hurt your hand pretty badly. If you have to do more than 4 or 5, your hand will be extremely sore. In the industry, we use compressed air machines or kick presses. So you just step on it really quick, and it just boom. The setter comes down and just immediately sets it. It's very quick. It's also very dangerous. My first week at my job right out of college, I saw someone got their finger stuck on the snap setter machine, and it was not a pretty sight. Hook and eye, which you've done before, just know there's a GIMP. And covered, this is covered, it can be covered with yarn, typically yarn or thread. GIMP is the style, this is metal, this is GIMP. Covered, adjustable, and this is for a skirt pant, and you can sew it on, by hand. Typically, it can be done mechanically as well. Small sizes are used for light to medium weight fabrics and larger sizes for heavier fabrics, so that's common sense. And the last is on zipper. So zipper size, because we didn't go, since we were pressed for time, didn't go into too much information on your zippers. So on part 2, we'll go over zippers to make sure that you understand how those work.